For Marx, history itself could be viewed as a never-ending sequence of battles between the oppressed and the oppressor. Now, Marx was more specific than that because he took an economic view of history, a deeply materialistic view of history, and believed that people were fundamentally motivated by economic motives. I never did buy that because I think one of the problems with that theory is that it doesn't ever answer the question what it is that people value. It assumes value implicitly and associates that with economic well-being, but that's by no means obvious. It's certainly not psychologically obvious that that's the case, and it's not actually how people behave, by the way, from a psychological perspective. So that's a big problem, but it doesn't matter. It's a theory that has at least some hypothetical explanatory power and no shortage of psychological attractiveness. That's certainly the case. So anyways, the basic Marxist idea, as I'm sure most of you know, is that the social world and life itself is a battle between those who have and those who don't have. And that the reason that those who have is because they take it from those who do not have. And that that's the most appropriate way to view history itself, I suppose stemming back as far back as you can imagine. And that it's also useful to think that way if you want to conceptualize the proper future, because the proper future would be one in which that essentially unjust division would be eradicated so that everyone would be equal in some fundamental way and so that there wouldn't be an owning class and a working class, let's say. The world's a rough place, you know, and there's no doubt that some people have it better at some times than other people, and some people have lives that are so unbearably tragic that it beggars the imagination, and other people seem to float through life with nary a worry, although I think that's also exaggerated because no matter how well off you are economically, you're still not really free from the fundamental tragedies of life, right? Your loved ones still get sick and struggle through life, and you're still subject to aging and eventually to death. So it's not like even at the upper end of the distribution, you're necessarily protected against the essential tragedy of life. And I also think that that's another problem with the Marxist worldview, is that it implicitly makes the case that the cause of human suffering is social injustice. And that's true in some sense, in that social injustice can amplify suffering, but it's certainly not the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering in some sense is life itself and its fundamental limitations. And it's really important to make a distinction between those two things, because otherwise you can easily be tempted to assume that you could bring the utopia in if you only adjusted the sociological conditions properly. And there's just no reason to assume that that's a reasonable perspective whatsoever, as far as I can tell. I think it's actually a form of existential cowardice to assume that, because it doesn't grapple with the real problem. And the real problem is that, well, the real problem is, as religious people have stated over and over throughout recorded history, is that life itself is suffering. That's a fundamental truth. I mean, it's certainly the truth, for example, it's a Buddhist truth, a fundamental Buddhist truth, and it's certainly graphically presented in the idea of the crucifixion. So, and that's a hard pill to swallow. It's a bitter pill to swallow, and it's comforting, I suppose, to think that if you just adjusted society properly, that all that suffering would go away, but there isn't really any evidence that that would occur. Now, I read George Orwell when I was a kid, probably about 17. I read a book called Road to Wigan Pier, which, if you haven't read, I would seriously recommend. It's a great book. It's in the same line in some sense as Animal Farm or 1984, although it's more journalistic. Orwell went to this coal mining town in northern UK called Wigan Pier and documented the lives of the working class coal miners who lived there. And I mean, to call their lives difficult, it's like you're not even scratching the surface, right? I mean, they were old by the time they were 40. Most of them had no teeth by the time they were 30. They lived in abysmal conditions, and the coal miners themselves, who of course developed black lung quite early in their life, had to crawl through short tunnels, 3.5 miles, just to get to their 8-hour shift, and then, which wasn't paid for, that was the commute fundamentally. Orwell, who was a rather tall man, said that after 500 yards he could hardly stand up. And of course then they had to I don't know, you don't call this crawling. It's not exactly walking. It's stooping, I suppose. It's not a normal form of ambulation. But in any case, they also had to do that after their 8-hour shift. And I mean, that's just the beginning. And so, Orwell, he engaged in the kind of argument that I think it's Brett Weinstein has coined the term steel man. You can make a straw man out of your opposition, which is a very bad idea because it weakens your ability to think, but you can also make a steel man out of your opponent. And so you even amplify the power of their arguments if you can manage it, so that when you formulate a rejoinder, the rejoinder is as powerful as it can possibly be. And of course, this is exactly what Orwell was doing. He was saying, look, like, if you had any sense, you'd have compassion for these working class people because their lives are just almost indescribably brutal. But then, in the last half of the book, he wrote this for the Left Book Club, which was a socialist book publishing entity that put out, I think, a book a month. And in the last half of the book, he switched to an analysis of what he saw as the failure of the Labour Party in the UK to attract as much attention, as much support from the general population as you might predict given the dismal conditions of the working class. And he wrote a line in there that I've never forgotten. I'd been working for a mildly socialist party in Canada at the time. I was about 16. Canada has a fairly long history of democratic socialism, and for a long time, the democratic socialists were a genuine voice for the working class. And the working class needs a political voice. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But I noticed something when I went to the political conventions, and what I noticed was that although many of the leaders that I saw met at that time, because I had fortunate access for reasons I won't go into, actually did seem to be genuinely concerned for the welfare of the working class. The lower level functionaries, especially the activist types, I didn't trust them when I met them. I didn't like them. They seemed to me to be mostly peevish and resentful, rather. And so they were motivated by something other than, I would say, sympathy for the working class. And Orwell said in the last half of Road to Wicked Pier that it was obvious that the sort of tweed-wearing middle-class socialist that was typical of the English socialist of that period didn't like the poor, he just hated the rich. And I never forgot that because I had observed that. That's what it seemed to catalyze the intuition that I had and fully articulate the intuition I had that there was something rotten in the state of Denmark and that what might be passing for empathy was actually masking something far darker. And one thing you do if you're a sensible person is you view your own positive motivations with a bit of skepticism, So if you're running around proclaiming that you're full of empathy for the working class, it's always worth giving some consideration to whether there's darker motives underneath your so-called saintly goodness, because, saintly goodness actually happens to be in rather short supply. And so if you're laying out a claim to that, you better be sure you're right. You better be sure you've examined your conscience. And of course, people tend not to do that because it's a rather dismal affair, examining your conscience, and you tend to find out that there's many dark things going under the surface that you'd rather not admit. And that's certainly the case in our world right now. So I knew then at that point, and that really removed me from the political sphere completely for, I would say, 40 years, because I learned that I didn't know what the hell I was talking about, which is a painful thing to learn. But in any case, I was quite convinced by Orwell's analysis that there was something other than brotherly compassion motivating the theory that the world could be properly divided into the oppressed and the oppressor, and that all of the suffering of humanity could be laid at the feet of that division. Because there's something convenient about it, especially if you identify yourself as the oppressed, because it gives you a more instantaneous moral stature, and it gives you the opportunity to act on that hypothetical moral stature. And the thing you might ask yourself too is, well, how do you know about the Marxists? How do you know if most of them had sympathy for the working class? Maybe that was genuine, and how can you distinguish that from resentment of the successful, let's say, by whatever means or along whatever dimension that's defined? And I would say, by the murders. So that's how. Because it seems to me, and this is a case that Solzhenitsyn made very, very clearly in the Gulag Archipelago, which is a book that every high school student in the United States should read, and none do. So none of them know about any of this. And that's an absolute crime, and it's a consequence of the, I would say, leftist domination of the education system, because it's a crucial document, maybe the crucial document of the 20th century, and we fought a whole Cold War over those issues. We put the planet at risk to lay that genocidal ideology to rest, and we haven't done it, and that's worth thinking about. But, you'd think, and so Solzhenitsyn, he knew that there were, that ideas had other ideas wrapped up inside them in some sense, that an idea had a manner of unfolding in time and space, in some sense like a computer program. Once you put it into a computer, it had, its internal logic would reveal itself across time and space inevitably, and when the internal logic of Marxism revealed itself, then hundreds of millions of people died. And, it'd be okay if it was just maybe, well, it happened in Russia and nowhere else, but it happened across the Soviet Union, it happened across China, it happened in Vietnam, it happened in Cambodia. It's like, how many damn examples do you need before you think that something's rotten in the state of Denmark? We've still got North Korea to deal with. I mean, what kind of place is that? Everyone there is starved, all the way through the 90s, essentially? It's a monstrous state, and it could still embroil us in an absolute catastrophe. So anyways, as far as I'm concerned, the historical evidence is in, and that the idea that the Marxist doctrine is genuinely based on sympathy for the working class is a lie. That history itself has shown that that's false. Now, maybe the revolutionaries back in 1917, they didn't know. They were, there was trouble in Russia in 1917, right? It was an ugly situation. And maybe they had sufficient justification to assume that their utopian vision was a historical possibility. I'm not convinced of that, by the way, but I think you could make that case. I think they were motivated by resentment and hatred right from the beginning. But you could make the case that at least they also had the benefit of ignorance, but we don't have that now. It's like, I don't know how much proof you need. If you need more proof than the 20th century provided, then the next layer of proof is going to be the annihilation of everything, because we came very, very close to that a number of times, especially in the late 20th century.